G'day everyone, and welcome to the second week of LA 3006 Administrative Law. This week it's time for a little bit of history to see the development of some of the key concepts that you'll need to understand throughout the rest of the subject. And some of these concepts have contemporary relevance too. So we're going to step back through the centuries to learn about what are called the prerogative writs of certiorari, mandamus, prohibition, habeas corpus, and quo warranto. Like so much of our law, administrative law traces its roots back through the centuries, and the only way to properly understand it is to properly understand that history. In this first video, we're going to start with the writ of certiorari, and it requires us to go a long way back to 1066, nearly 1,000 years ago. William the Conqueror, a French noble from Normandy, has landed an invading force in southern England and defeated the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. He continued his invasion, and on Christmas Day 1066 he was crowned the King of all England. This was a great victory, but also a big problem. How does a king keep order in such a large new kingdom? Normandy is in France. He spoke French. He didn't even speak the same language as his new subjects. He had no drones, no CCTV, no highways, no internet. Most of the major roads were still based on old Roman roads established 600 years earlier. The only way to manage the country was to divide it up. We already talked about this last week. The king was the boss of the dukes, and the dukes were the bosses of the earls. The earls were the bosses of the barons, and the barons were the bosses of the knights, and so on down the line. Now that was a good enough theory, but it ran into some practical issues. You see, around this time, many of the nobles were actually in the Middle East, fighting in the Crusades. And even when they were in England, they were generally more interested in pleasant life than in the details of administration. A lot of the actual work on the ground in this system was done by officers known as sheriffs. Most people have heard the word sheriff in the context of American westerns. The sheriffs there were essentially just the rudimentary precursors of police. Forget about them. The other place where most people have heard the word sheriff is the Sheriff of Nottingham, the traditional bad guy in the Robin Hood legends. If you think about those legends, it's pretty clear that in the Nottingham area, the sheriff was the boss. He wasn't a noble, he wasn't a duke or an earl or something, but he was the one actually running the joint. That's the sort of sheriff we're talking about here. They did everything from keeping the peace to collecting taxes and rents to settling disputes. But the king spent a lot of time in Normandy and the rest of his time in London. The nobles were off crusading or at court in London or Normandy, or they had lands in France themselves. When the cat's away, the mice will play. Over the first 100 years, the sheriffs started to get way too big for their boots. They became corrupt and began to act almost like little dictators. It started to get out of hand, and in 1170, King Henry II had what was called the Inquest of Sheriffs. He dismissed almost all the sheriffs, chucked them out. The big lesson of the Inquest of Sheriffs was that delegating power to lower level rulers and administrators only works if you have a way to check up on them and make sure they're using their powers properly, following the rules. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Admin law is just the modern way of making sure that people who have power use their powers properly and follow the rules. Now, around the same time, the kings started to realise that their commands could be implemented more effectively, particularly across large distances, if the commands were put in writing. They called these written royal commands writs. Gradually, they developed different types of writs for common purposes, almost like form letters. There were writs for all sorts of things. One sort of writ was the writ of certiorari. Translated, this means a writ of certification. Certiorari occurred when the central government in London decided to call a decision from one of those outlying counties of England and to review or certify that decision. It was a great way to make sure the sheriffs didn't get out of hand again. Their decisions were always potentially subject to being called before the king or the higher nobles under a writ of certiorari. Because they knew that, and because they remembered that all the previous sheriffs had been given the boot for failing to follow those rules, they were kept under much better control. Certiorari then began to be used by the courts as well. It became a method by which the royal courts in London could call before them a decision made by a lower court, and they could review or certify it. Nowadays, we'd call that an appeal. So a person who wanted the central courts to review the decision of an assize court, one of the more provincial courts, could apply for a writ of certiorari, and if the writ was granted, the case would be reviewed. To this day in the United States, they still refer to appeals as occurring under a grant of certiorari. In a case heard around 1560 called Hilton and Lawson, a dispute about the ownership of a parcel of land was taken before the Court of Chancery in Durham, which is located way up near the Scottish border. Durham is about 430 kilometres from London. Not much by our standards, but a massive distance in the UK, particularly in 1560. Durham was a reasonable place to bring the action because the disputed land was in Durham. However, one of the defendants was described in the report as a diseased old man who lived in Middlesex near London. He was not able to follow his suit if the trial was held in Durham, and so the Court of Chancery in London issued a writ of certiorari to remove the trial to London. So initially, the writ of certiorari was all about keeping an eye on the decisions of outlying rulers by allowing for the review of those decisions by the king or others in the king's court. But then it gradually came to be mostly the process by which appeals were managed. Eventually, though, certiorari expanded again, combining both of those ideas. It became a writ by which a person could seek a review of a ruler's decision and eventually a public servant's decision by having that decision brought before the courts. Certiorari was therefore a powerful type of writ. It is the means by which a court can reach out to any other decision maker and demand the right to review their decision. It's the whole basis of administrative law. It says that nobody gets to make decisions without the potential for some higher authority to review those decisions. When the common law was imported into Australia, the writ of certiorari came right along with it. So in 1862, in a case called Berry and Graham, a landowner near Shoalhaven in New South Wales was issued with a rates notice just after the municipality of Shoalhaven was formed. He didn't want to pay on the basis that when the proposal for the municipality was first made, the proposed boundaries didn't include his land. If the proposed boundaries had included his land, he might have been able to do things. For instance, he could have objected to the inclusion of his land. He might have stood for election as one of the councillors and affected the level of rates. He might have voted. But he didn't get to do those things because it was a surprise to him that his land was even part of this new municipality of Shoalhaven. He said that because his land was never part of the advertised boundaries of the municipality, the government of New South Wales should not have included his land in the municipality, so he shouldn't have to pay rates. He was upset at the decision. He wanted it reviewed. He went to the Supreme Court of New South Wales and applied for a writ of certiorari so that the court could review the decision. The court issued the writ, reviewed the decision, and found that the Municipalities Act did not give the government the power to extend the boundaries beyond those which had been applied for and advertised. The court therefore quashed the decision, and Mr. Berry did not have to pay rates. See how it works? A government agency made a decision. Mr. Berry felt the decision had not been made properly. He asked the courts to review the decision, and the court, by a writ of certiorari, called the decision before them. The court reviewed the decision, found he was right, and then reported back to the government that the demand for him to pay rates was unlawful. The little guy wins. Certiorari is therefore the historical foundation of administrative law. Certiorari says that if your rights or interests are affected by a government decision, you can have that decision brought in front of a higher authority to be reviewed. At the start, centuries ago, it made nobles accountable to the king. Nowadays, it makes decision makers accountable to the courts. Now, as we'll discover as we proceed through the course, in many cases, certiorari is no longer practically used. The reason for this is that the ADJR Act gives people a range of statutory rights to seek review of a decision. And in addition, many hundreds of individual pieces of legislation allow people to apply for administrative review through a tribunal. Finally, Section 33 of the Judiciary Act 1903 grants to the High Court a range of additional review powers. However, the spirit of certiorari lives on. Normal citizens can still apply to have the decisions of public servants reviewed. Next, we're going to look at two more of these writs. They're called mandamus and prohibition. At least one of them has a sensible name, right?